All right, so we're diving deep into business storytelling today. And we're going to be looking at Jyoti Guptara's book, Business Storytelling, From Hype to Hack.
Okay.
And one of the things that really kind of jumped out at me was that even Amazon has ditched PowerPoint for storytelling in their internal comms.
Interesting.
They use these things called narratives.
Yeah.
And they're 6-page memos. Can you imagine?
Wow.
Starting every meeting with like a 30-minute read. So what is the method to this madness?
Well, it's really interesting how they've tapped into this power of storytelling for clarity and for engagement.
Yeah.
And I think one thing that's really interesting about these narratives is that they force people to slow down and actually think and digest the information rather than just having these flashy PowerPoint presentations where, you might miss a key point.
Right.
And so by having everyone literally on the same page and reading the same story,
Yeah.
it really kind of helps foster shared understanding and encourages a deeper level of thinking about the content.
It's like they've hacked the way our brains work.
Yeah.
Guptara even goes to the science behind this and how our brains are wired to respond to story.
Right, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
He mentions this Harvard psychologist, Dan Gilbert,
Okay.
and this concept of the brain as an experience simulator. And I think that's a really powerful concept to think about because, when you're reading a captivating book
Yeah.
or you're watching an engaging film, your brain is not just passively taking in information, it's actually simulating that experience.
Oh, wow.
Your mirror neurons are firing as if you were living the story firsthand. So you're experiencing those emotions, you're seeing the sights, you're hearing the sounds. And so that's really the power of storytelling is it's not just appealing to the logical part of our brain, it's going straight to the emotional core.
Okay, I need a moment to process this. Is anyone else feeling like their brain is doing gymnastics right now?
It's a workout.
Yeah, so it's not just about being entertaining, it's about creating this deeper connection.
Yeah.
And that makes me think about something else that Guptara highlights,
Okay.
which is we often undervalue our own experiences.
Mm.
He tells this anecdote about the first consul in Switzerland,
Mm-hmm.
and she initially thought she had no stories to tell.
Okay.
Then she realized that even her everyday struggles, like trying to find a bilingual school for her children, were actually incredibly relatable and humanizing.
Yeah, that's a great example of how we dismiss our own experiences as ordinary,
Right?
when in fact they can be powerful stories in the right context.
Yeah.
And what seems mundane to us might actually resonate very deeply with somebody else. So I think, listener, that's something to think about. Like what seemingly boring moments in your life could actually be powerful stories waiting to be told.
That is a great question for all of us to ponder.
Yeah.
And speaking of using stories to connect and build trust,
Okay.
there's this fascinating example of a wealth manager, Jay Zeltner, who used a personal anecdote to connect with ultra-high net worth individuals.
Right.
So tell me about this.
Well, what's powerful about his approach is the vulnerability.
Okay.
He shares a story about growing up in the countryside where trust was earned by being invited to someone's kitchen table. Yeah, it's a simple story, but it's incredibly effective because it highlights this universal human experience, this desire for connection and belonging.
It makes you wonder what makes you trustworthy.
Yep.
Is it your expertise or your willingness to go the extra mile or maybe your ability to share authentic stories that resonate with others?
That's a great point.
No, I'm curious, isn't there a risk of stories being manipulative?
Absolutely.
How do we ensure authenticity when using storytelling in a business context?
Well, I think the key is authenticity.
Okay.
The most effective stories and the ones that are genuine and heartfelt and not fabricated or designed to manipulate.
Right.
It's about finding those moments that truly reflect your values, your experiences, and your perspective.
So it's not about spinning tales.
No.
It's about tapping into real experiences.
Exactly.
And sometimes those experiences can be challenging. Guptara talks about using storytelling to address sensitive issues like rumors of gender discrimination in the workplace. He introduces this idea of a preempt story, which I have to admit I'm not familiar with.
So a preempt story is basically a technique where you address a sensitive issue indirectly
Okay.
by sharing a relevant anecdote that kind of subtly shifts the conversation. So it's about reading the room, understanding the unspoken concerns, and choosing a story that disarms those objections without directly confronting them.
So instead of denying the rumors,
Right.
you might share a story about mentoring and promoting a female colleague.
Exactly.
Or a time when you faced bias yourself.
Yeah.
And it's about using the story to create empathy and understanding.
Right.
But how do you choose the right story for such a delicate situation?
Well, choosing the right story is crucial.
Yeah.
You want to choose a story that's authentic, that's relatable, and that subtly addresses the underlying concerns
Right.
without feeling forced or preachy.
Yeah.
It's about connecting with your audience on an emotional level and creating a space for open dialogue and really, facilitating a deeper understanding of the issue at hand.
So,
Yeah, it's about finding that right story that is, feels genuine and serves its purpose without being too preachy
right.
and talking about purpose.
Yeah.
Gupta also highlights how stories can be incredibly effective for communicating strategy
Okay.
and change within an organization.
Yeah, because we've all been in those meetings where the strategy is presented in this like dry, abstract way that just doesn't connect.
Exactly.
And I was reading this MIT Sloan Management Review article that talked about how often strategies actually fail
Right.
because they aren't communicated effectively.
Yeah. And it's one thing to have, a brilliant strategy,
Right.
but it's useless if people don't understand it or buy into it.
Yeah.
So that's where storytelling comes in.
Okay.
And Guptara actually introduces this framework by Sean Callahan called the 4 Ps of strategy stories,
Okay.
which is a fantastic tool for crafting narratives that really make the strategy come alive.
I am all ears. Break down these 4 Ps for me.
Okay, so the 4 Ps stand for past pivot, present priority, and pitfalls and potential.
Okay.
So essentially, you're weaving a story that explains where the organization has been,
Okay.
why change is necessary,
Got it.
what the new direction is, and what's at stake.
So it's like taking people on a journey,
Yeah,
starting with that shared history, and then highlighting the turning point, and then finally painting a picture of the future.
exactly. And by framing it as a story,
Yeah.
you're not just conveying information.
Right.
You're inviting people to be a part of the narrative.
Yeah.
So it's about co-creating meaning and fostering a sense of ownership.
That would be way more engaging than like a bullet point presentation.
For sure.
Now, Gupta takes this idea of storytelling even further with this concept of hacking yourself,
Yes,
which sounds very intriguing.
this is where things get really interesting.
Okay.
So he talks about Richard Wiseman's luck experiment,
Okay.
which found that people who consider themselves lucky are actually just better at spotting and seizing opportunities.
Okay.
And it all comes down to the stories that we tell ourselves.
Wait, you're telling me that lucky people are just better storytellers?
In a sense, yes,
Mm.
because they've cultivated this narrative of being lucky.
Right.
And so they see the world through that lens,
Interesting.
and they're more attuned to possibilities, and they're more likely to take action.
So it's like that experience simulator
Yes,
we were
sir.
talking about earlier. So if you're constantly telling yourself you're unlucky
Right.
or unsuccessful,
You're more likely to create that reality.
so it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy.
It is.
If we're telling ourselves these negative stories, we're limiting our potential.
Yes, and that's why it's so important to become aware of these internal narratives and start editing them.
Wow, that's a wake-up call.
It is, and it's incredibly empowering
Yeah.
because we have the power to change those stories.
Yeah.
And Guptara even shares a personal story about how he reframed a negative self-narrative and the positive changes that it brought to his life.
You know what? I've actually had a similar experience.
Really?
Yeah. I used to tell myself I wasn't a good public speaker,
Okay.
and it just became this self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah.
But then I started reframing that story and focusing on the times when I had really connected with an audience.
Right?
And you know what? It made a huge difference in my confidence.
It's amazing how much power our stories hold.
Yeah.
And that brings us to another really practical tool that Guptara suggests,
Okay.
which is building a story bank.
I've heard of this before, but I'd love to hear your take on it.
Yeah.
What exactly is a story bank and why is it so valuable?
So a story bank is essentially a collection of personal and professional anecdotes
Okay.
that you can draw on in different situations.
Mm-hmm.
So think of it as a toolbox filled with powerful communication tools.
Okay.
So you need to make a point in a meeting, tell a story.
Got it.
Trying to connect with a new client, share an anecdote.
Okay.
Want to overcome an objection, use a story to illustrate your point.
So it's about having those go-to stories ready to go
Exactly.
whenever you need them.
Yeah.
But how do you even start building a story bank?
It's easier than you might think.
Okay.
Just start by paying attention to the stories that you encounter every day.
Okay.
What moments make you laugh, think, or feel inspired.
Mm-hmm.
Jot them down, reflect on your own experiences.
Uh-huh.
What challenges have you overcome? What lessons have you learned?
So it's like mining for gold.
Yes,
We all have these stories within us. We just need to start excavating them.
exactly.
But what about structure? I'm guessing not all stories are created equal.
You're absolutely right. And that's where Guptara introduces Kevin Brickman's
Okay.
1-2-1 story formula,
Okay.
which is this really simple but effective framework
Yeah.
for crafting compelling stories.
Okay. I like it simple and effective. I'm in.
So the 1 stands for 1 point.
Okay.
Your story should have 1 clear takeaway.
Got it.
The 2 represents 2 halves.
Okay.
So a setup and a payoff.
Mm-hmm.
And the final one is for 1 unforgettable detail, something that makes the story stick in the listener's mind.
So it's all about clarity, structure, and memorability.
Exactly.
Do you have an example that illustrates this formula?
Absolutely. So Guptara uses a story of Rock-10 CEO,
Okay.
Worley Brown.
Okay.
So instead of shutting down a failing plant,
Mm-hmm.
Brown met with every worker and said, "I believe in you. What do you need?" A year later, that plant became the company's most productive.
Wow, that's incredible. What a powerful example of leadership and belief.
It is.
How does that story fit into the 1-2-1 formula?
So the point of the story is the power of belief and support.
Right.
The 2 halves are the failing plant versus the thriving plant.
Okay.
And the unforgettable detail is that simple but powerful phrase,
Yeah.
"I believe in you. What do you need?"
I love how that story packs such an emotional punch.
It does.
It's a reminder that sometimes the simplest stories
Yeah,
are the most effective.
absolutely. And you don't need to be a Shakespeare to tell a good story.
Right.
It's just about finding those moments in your life that illustrate a point or a lesson or a value.
And that makes me think about those who am I stories that we tell ourselves and others.
Right.
Guptara actually suggests having a few key personal business stories ready to go.
Okay.
And he calls them the 4 W's.
Yeah, those are a great starting point.
Okay.
So you have your who story, which is all about who you are as a person,
Right.
what makes you unique and interesting.
Okay.
And then there's your what story,
Mm-hmm.
which explains what you do in a way that resonates with your audience.
I'm guessing the why story is about your purpose and motivation.
Exactly why you do what you do.
Right.
And then finally there's your way story, which
Okay.
explains your process, your approach,
Okay.
what makes you different.
So it's like having a story for every occasion.
Yes.
And I love how this framework provides a really structured approach to crafting those core narratives. But how do you suggest weaving those 4 ways into conversations naturally? I don't want to be like, and now for my why story.
No, it's all about context and relevance.
Okay.
So, for example, if someone asked about your background,
Mm-hmm.
that's a natural opening to share your who story.
Right.
Or if you're explaining a new project, you might weave in your way story
Yeah.
to highlight your unique approach.
So it's about being intentional and finding those organic opportunities
Yeah,
to share those pre-crafted narratives.
exactly.
This brings up an interesting point.
Yeah.
How can we use storytelling not just for personal branding,
Right.
but also at an organizational level? That's a great question. How do we take these personal storytelling techniques and apply them to something as large as an entire organization?
Right. Well, the principles are the same. You know, Guptara talks about how organizations can use storytelling to shape their culture, to communicate their strategy, and even to drive change.
Mm-hmm.
It's about weaving a narrative that brings the company's values to life.
So it's not just about slogans and mission statements. It's about showing what those values actually look like in action.
Exactly. He gives the example of IBM, which used storytelling to engage employees in this company-wide discussion about values.
Okay.
And they created this online platform called Values Jam, where employees could share their stories and experiences.
So they basically crowdsourced their culture.
Yeah,
That's brilliant.
it was very clever.
But how do you make sure that those stories actually align with the desired culture?
Right. Well, it's about creating a framework that encourages authenticity,
Okay.
but that also guides the narrative in a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
So IBM provided prompts that encouraged employees to share stories about times when they demonstrated the company's values.
So it's like giving them a starting point, but allowing their unique voices and experiences to shape the overall story.
Exactly. And it was incredibly successful. It helped to create this shared understanding of IBM's values and how they were actually lived out in everyday work.
Yeah.
So it wasn't just words on a page. It was about bringing those values to life through real stories from real people.
That's such a powerful example of how storytelling can create a sense of shared identity and purpose within an organization.
Yeah,
But what about using stories to drive change? I mean, that can be a really tough nut to crack.
absolutely. Change is never easy, and people naturally resist it.
Yeah.
Guptara talks about a CEO who had to make some tough decisions
Mm-hmm.
that were met with a lot of pushback from employees.
Okay.
And instead of just presenting the facts and figures, He started sharing stories about why these changes were necessary.
He put a human face on the situation.
Exactly. He talked about the challenges the company was facing, the opportunities they were missing, and the potential consequences of inaction.
Yeah.
He used stories to create this sense of urgency and shared purpose.
So he wasn't just dictating change, he was inviting people to join him on the journey.
Precisely. And it worked.
Wow.
By sharing those stories, he was able to get buy-in from the employees and move the organization forward.
It's a reminder that logic alone rarely inspires change.
Right.
But stories have this power to connect with people's hearts and minds.
Yeah, they do.
It's funny, thinking back on all the stories we've discussed today, we talk about the science behind why stories work,
Yeah.
the importance of authenticity and vulnerability, the power of personal anecdotes,
Right.
and even how to craft those go-to stories. We explored how to use storytelling to build trust, to address sensitive issues, to communicate strategy, and even to drive change within organizations.
A lot to take in.
It is, listener. If you're feeling overwhelmed, just remember it all comes back to one key principle. Start noticing the stories around you.
Yes. Pay attention to the stories that you encounter in your daily life, the ones that make you laugh or cry or think or feel inspired.
Yeah.
And then start collecting your own stories. Write them down. Share them with friends. Refine them. The more we embrace the power of stories, the more we can unlock our potential as humans and as leaders.
What a fantastic way to wrap up this deep dive.
Well, thank you.
Expert speaker, thank you so much for sharing your insights and expertise with us today.
It's been my pleasure.
Listener, I hope this deep dive has left you feeling inspired and equipped to harness the power of storytelling in your own life. And remember, everyone has a story to tell. What's yours? 4BIO.